topic for tonight will be tariffs, given kind of how that's been dominating the news. We will have those announcements, like our secretary was saying about the future of the space. That'll be announced whenever that's finalized. That shouldn't be too far from now. Anyway, so the talk tonight will be tariffs. I'll start off with sort of what I think is a brief summary of what's going on. Obviously, though, we're happy to riff on conversations. That's what makes these spaces good. And so, yeah, let's just start with this. So, Trump announced tariffs. So, under U.S. law, I think Congress gave him permission to do this. I don't know if it's in the Constitution, but Congress passed a law allowing the presidency to have unilateral control over tariffs that are placed on imports. So, again, an import tariff, in case there was any confusion about it, all it means is that when a company ships in anything from an overseas manufacturer, in fact, it could even be raw materials. There is the value of that material is assessed at the port, and then a certain tax is levied on it. And that tax is what a tariff is. They haven't been used much in the last 80 years or so as a way to promote free trade, but Trump is bringing them back. The recent round of tariffs were assigned on the basis of trade deficit. So if you had, for example, a 25% trade deficit with the U.S., you were given a 25% tariff. This was done for, as far as I understand, every nation on Earth, even including islands that have a population of supposedly zero, although we somehow still have a $600,000 trade deficit with them. So, you know,
Yeah, with those islands, people
some of these
always try to point that out to dunk on
a good
oh,
bit.
Luke
I
Bot.
would if it recovers all of its losses within a week or so. But the one country that has not received reduced tariffs is China. China now has 125% tariffs assigned to it. For the other nations, their tariffs haven't gone away. It's still just paused for 90 days with a minimum tariff of 10% still laid across the board. And I imagine the idea will be to pressure more countries into decoupling from Chinese industry. We'll see exactly what those negotiations look like. Um, let's see. That's pretty much the situation on the ground. We have a good number of people here. Does anyone here have any other details they would like to add as far as what's going on the ground? I'd be particularly interested to hear if your industry is impacted by it too, because with those with that many tariffs, I'm sure there's various people whose industries have been hit by it.
I will say, you're talking about the islands. People always, or recently at least, have been using those unpopulated islands as a way to dunk on the president. Like, oh, you're tariffing penguins. Well, no, it's these islands are almost always overseas dependencies of usually either France or Britain or Australia. But due to the legality of them being an overseas territory of the host nation, they have essentially, in the past at least, been ways to circumvent tariff duties and tax laws. So it's really crossing our T's and dotting our I's with the tariffs. And liberals just don't seem to understand that, but they don't know things.
Yeah, that was always like my immediate thought when they brought up that as a meme. It's like, well, whatever is living there, we have a $600,000 trade deficit with it. So unless the penguins are like shipping us stuff, I mean, it's obviously just some company using it as a launching point. We received like $2 million worth of imports from that specific island in 2024. The real question going forward will be whether Trump is meaning to just have high tariffs across the board. He's clearly pretty interested in keeping at least a 10% one there. I don't know if he'll keep them all as high as he has been. I think people are trying to figure out whether he's trying to push America more in a sort of autocracy direction or whether he's specifically targeting China. After the results today, I tend to think he's probably trying to hit China more directly because that would be the main reason you would push autarky anyways if you were preparing for conflict. So if he could defuse the conflict before it becomes violent, I mean, that would solve a lot of the problem kind of in advance.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't um our exports make up like 40% of China's GDP or something like that?
Okay, so that's kind of hard to grasp. So I was looking into that today. If you're looking at, what percentage of their GDP is directly tied to them exporting to the U.S. consumer market, it's like 3.5 to 4.5%. But what you have to understand is that if you're in a heavy manufacturing economy, you can't measure percentage of economy relying on exports just on the sheer value of the export itself. You have to keep in mind that, like, for every 1% of your GDP that's reliant on exports, you have a larger percentage of your economy that's tied up in the production of those exports. So, if China were to lose access to our market permanently, it wouldn't just be a 4% GDP reduction. It would also be all of the financing and manufacturing going behind in the background that makes it possible for them to create those exports. And then, of course, that's before you get even into like financing arrangements with their banks that are based off of future exports that would end up going bankrupt. There's a whole lot that goes into that. So it's hard to tie it down exactly, but yes, China's economy is very, very, very heavily invested into the U.S. market. And then, of course, I'm exporting to other countries too, which I think Trump is also trying to impact and using kind of the tariffs on those countries as a negotiation tool to make them do that.
So for the layman like me, who understands close to nothing about tariffs, is 10% considered a high figure? Because to me, 10% doesn't sound like all that much. But Trump talked about 10% and people lost their minds. So
10% is high when you're used to a lot less than that. In many cases, just 0%. A lot of companies run on fairly thin margins, and adding a 10%, like a 10% automatic increase in cost, will throw off a lot of people's balance sheets. Um, and then there's also the consideration that Trump could end up raising them higher. Like if you're a Chinese company, 125%, that's an enormous increase. That's over double. But even for the rest of the world, if you're accustomed to zero, maybe 1%, I mean, a tenfold increase and that cost is going to hit you pretty hard, especially the way most companies are structured now. It's partly because companies today rely on cost cutting as opposed to profit maximization. So until about the 90s, it was more common for companies to use what I believe was called a profit maximization strategy, where your entire goal was to just juice cash flow and you were willing to incur enormous expenses to ensure that cash flow. The problem was if that cash flow ever got interrupted because you had so much debt, you would become insolvent pretty quickly. And so in the 90s, you saw a big push to go for the cost cutting method where instead of maximizing cash flow, you minimize cost. And so if you're operating on that model, and that's been kind of the standard model for 30 or 35 years at least, um, if you see a major uptick in cost all of a sudden, that's going to really throw you off.
but didn't the problems with COVID and how that absolutely turned the world economy upside down? Then that kind of proved that the Lean Six Sigma approach to companies might not be that resilient or a smart move. If things go sideways.
Yeah, so they should have learned that, shouldn't they? And and they didn't. That's honestly the biggest failure of the business leadership class after COVID was recognizing that, you know, this push for greater and greater efficiency, which in many ways seemed like an economic miracle, it really depends on everything going right. And and so when something goes very wrong, like COVID, it really just screws you. And they should have learned that lesson and they didn't. And it looks like Trump is going to try to teach them again. hopefully if some of these tariffs, like especially the 10% minimum, just get locked in, it'll teach companies that this is just a new reality that you have to deal with. I think with COVID, people were just hoping that we would all just forget about it and move on. And I think Trump is trying to teach everyone that, look, like the lessons that we learned from COVID, which he saw, 25 years prior, and everyone should have seen prior. What he was seeing is a lesson they should have learned from COVID. They didn't learn it, and so those tariffs are going to kind of force everyone to learn it.
Yeah, I know that a lot of businesses really forecasted for the status quo. And I think you saw that reaction once these tariffs started kicking in. Like I know that there were several companies that started discussing cutting staff and different things like that. And their projections for this year were high. Like a lot of people were expecting economic downturn, maybe starting in 26 or 27, but a lot of them are trying to bring that in just from the overall reaction to the tariffs.
Yeah, it really is remarkable. Trump set a deadline for those tariffs. It's not, and again, he also ran on a tariff platform. So here's a candidate. He gets elected, and if you're going back just to the election, the market had plenty of time to predict this. Like everyone knew Trump was going to be president at least like 5 or 6 months ago. He ran on tariffs. When he got in office, he set a deadline for these tariffs. The market should have been pricing this in, and they didn't because there's just so much normalcy bias. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. Like, there's no excuse for that. I mean, it's essentially
It's almost like they didn't believe him.
Yeah.
I mean, because he kept saying it. I mean, he said it on Rogan too, and he was like, "The most beautiful word ever is tariff, Joe," and he like goes on about it, and like every podcast he was on was like tariff, 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 and I don't know what the elite ruling class kind of thought or the like, but I mean, he went through with it, and they should have expected that, and then once he was in office, he kept talking about it. It wasn't like he was not talking about it anymore. He gave him a deadline, said, "Hey, this is when it's going to be." And I think it's just like most of our corporate elites or our ruling class and anybody that works like for a larger company, it's like they just kind of wait till things catch on fire and then they start reacting instead of being proactive about anything. And that's just kind of, I mean, maybe this is just our current class of leadership is just react rather than be proactive with what we're going to do. But I mean, honestly, everybody kind of owes the United States a little bit of money because, the whole United States Navy's main purpose right now is to allow this free trade that's been going on basically since World War II, where we basically picked up the slack from the United Kingdom and started being the ocean police. So I don't understand what the big deal is with a lot of these corporate types.
I really do think it was just normalcy bias. They just refused to believe that it was going to change, and so they didn't bother pricing it in. Which is honestly a big lesson for people who think that, I mean, like, there's kind of this meme that, it's priced in, like, the market's like this quasi omnipotent thing that just prices in everything, and it just doesn't. I mean, like, any normal person would have priced in tariffs and they just didn't do it because they just didn't believe it would happen. And the market actually does that quite a bit. Like, the market is good at predicting eventualities, or at least pricing in eventualities. But, I mean, the people who run these things are human. And sometimes they want to believe something's going to happen. And so they just don't bother planning for it. And then you get a market drop like we saw.
Do you think that they had an idea that maybe the courts might step in? Or, I mean, we've seen this with the deportations, we've seen this with the military now. Do you think that they thought that there was a slim chance, or they were just kind of banking on the courts tying up this thing and dragging it out and eventually him losing interest? Or
Maybe,
normalcy bias?
maybe because in the first term, if you remember, a lot of times he would get undermined by his secretaries. It wasn't even the courts. So whenever Trump wanted to do something too crazy, you had the Secretary of State kind of slow ball him, or you had, the defense guy stall him, or you would have, The Treasury
Yeah, that's what happened in
Secretary.
Syria.
Oh yeah, no, like in Syria, that was the most egregious example that I can remember. Like they just lied. They just said we're going to leave, and they didn't.
Yeah, Mathis or Mad Dog Mattis, they were supposed to get those guys out of Syria, and actually, I was over in Kuwait at that time, and there's a place called like Wash Rack over at Kuwait Naval Base, and that's where all your vehicles come in from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and then they're supposed to ship them back home. But like they were slow rolling that thing as well, getting those units out of there, just taking their time. While we were still increasing troop numbers, and what they were doing were they would do things like, okay, we're going to rotate you into Iraq for like 40 something days or like 29 days, and then we're going to pull you back into Kuwait on a flight, and then tomorrow we're going to roll you back out to Syria, and then you'll stay there for a certain amount of time. So they were playing this numbers game with how that, like your combat pay status works, and so they can manufacture basically a fake number, even though there might be like 5,000 guys in the region, but on paper it's showing like, oh, we've only got 2,500 troops in Iraq, but they were just rotating them from country to country, or like making them hit Jordan, every 29 days to basically reset the clock.
Yeah, there was so much of that in the first term. Same too, if you remember, like the fiasco with Jeff Sessions, like how the Attorney General would just like never do what Trump needed them to do. There was always that kind of stonewalling. And maybe you're right. Maybe the market was just betting on the deep state. I mean, to put it in crude terms. And they're just learning that it's just not a good bet this time, which is actually very positive for us. It's just the market's not happy about it. But honestly, they'll cope and they'll get over it. And they have to anyway, because everything we want to do is going to cause market volatility. I mean, so there's something to consider here too. Like, mass deportations are going to cause a shock to the stock market. If you tried to like substantially deal with Social Security, it would cause a shock on the stock market. Like any sort of conflict will cause a shock on the stock market. Like if you're dealing with like a foreign power, like everything that has to happen, like the market's not going to like it because the market likes normalcy. And so it may be good that Trump was just like kind of getting that out of the way at the beginning. And frankly, if Trump keeps extending these tariff things where he just pauses them and never gets rid of them, which kind of creates a sense of uncertainty, that could kind of be a little bit of a smokescreen almost. So, like, any sort of disturbance caused by continued deportations, for example, like it can just be blamed on the tariffs. I actually heard someone suggest today, I think it might be right, that some tech companies are going to use the market volatility to sort of phase out their projected investments into AI. Like there's all these companies that wanted to invest in AI, but they're kind of realizing that they overcommitted and it was probably going to be a financial loss. So, for example, Microsoft today announced that they were ending their AI venture as a result of the market fluctuation. But in reality, they're probably just backing away from it because they realize the AI is a little bit overhyped and they didn't want to lose all that money on it. And they're using the market as an excuse to do so. But, like Trump could also use something like that. And, as long as the market's kind of in flux, you can get away with doing a lot of other things that you had to do without it causing a big headline, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it really feels like he's hitting them from different fronts. I mean, this this kind of week started out at the end of last week with tariffs. The week before that was the immigration thing. You had some stuff going on in the DoD with how Pete Hegseth is trying to restructure combat arms, which women have no business being in, just period. But you're going to have to slow walk that back. You just can't remove women from combat arms overnight. You're going to have to basically prove to the American people that they don't meet the standards, and then start walking that whole thing back where you normalize things again. Kind of like a Ron DeSantis approach with how he did abortion, where you go from like 20 weeks to, I don't know, 16 to then like you're at 9, and now you're at like a heartbeat. And you just kind of you speed run it. You don't do like the long march to the institution, because we don't really have that kind of time on the right. But you have to a certain degree, normalize it. Let the media like freak out about it, and then nothing really happens that affects the American people's like day-to-day life. And I don't really think the stock market affects most like blue collar workers anyway, because most blue collar workers and most Americans don't even have stock. I don't know who I was talking to about that, but I mean, you have a small percentage of people that basically own the market, and then your big hedge fund guys and all that stuff that are kind of playing in it. But other than that, this isn't going to negatively affect you at probably 30 years old or even 40. So I mean, most people are going to forget about this here by the end of this week anyway.
Well, it negatively impacts blue collar workers in the sense that, like, stock fluctuations do impact large contractors, and if your large contractors are doing poorly, then you'll get less hires, and then at the same time, if the market goes too bad, people are going to not be active in the housing market. So you'll have less houses. I mean, these things do matter. I don't know if we want to get to the point where we say it doesn't matter. Although I will say it matters like directly a lot less if you don't have a big portfolio. I think like the better selling point is to say it does matter, but there's things that matter a little bit more right now. And the relative hit to the market is worth it in the short term. For one, because there's just important things we have to do that are non-economic, but also two, the economy itself is kind of running on sugar, if you want to put it that way. It's not healthy, it's overinflated, and it needs to be adjusted anyway. So like the big selling point is that we're just taking our medicine, and taking your medicine is never fun, but you just have to do it, and we'll end up better in the long run if we do it. I mean, I think that's really just how you have to do it.
Well, isn't 15% or something like that of our GDP made up by the finance? And I've heard some people throw around a number, something like that, and to me, it seems like 15% of your country's productivity, being held up in imaginary money probably isn't very healthy. So, if the market starts coming down, wouldn't that help, ease that blister?
Yeah, I mean, if there's a bubble in the market, something like this will help pop it before it gets too large. I mean, there is some truth to that. It's hard.
And that's the thing right there,
Yeah,
because even when it was at its low yesterday or the day before, it's still overvalued. A lot of these companies are trading at large multiples that we've never even seen before. It's hype keeping them up. So readjusting, and that bubble is going to pop anyway. So having somewhat of a control on it does help in the long run.
no, it does. Yeah, it's hard because the stock market represents investment into the company. So companies are always going to want to have higher stocks. But the problem is, have you ever heard the effect? And I can't remember the name idea that if you create a test to measure something, if you're not careful, the people or things you're measuring will start to conform themselves to the test instead of behaving normally. I forget what that concept's called. Like, there's a name for it, but that does happen with the stock market. So, for example, traditionally, the stock market was a place for you to invest in companies. Hopefully, the investment would improve, and you could increase your wealth that way. The problem is that a company's stock value is also not really deeply tied into the sort of financing you can get from banks. Like, really juice their stocks at the expense of things like paying their employees enough, for example, or they'll sometimes just I mean, like in worst case, that like they'll just resort to straight up fraud to do that, or companies will just become so concerned about like buying and trading stocks that they will ignore even the quality of their own product. I mean, again, like, it's not a bad thing in itself, but the culture of it has gotten out of control, and I don't really know what the solution is. But yeah, there does need to be a move away from this kind of myopic obsession with the just perpetual rising of the stock market, because for one, it's unsustainable, And two, in order to prioritize it over everything, you end up sacrificing a lot of what even makes your company worth anything in its own right. It just becomes an investment firm almost instead of, an actual company that produces goods for the consumer.
I mean, don't boomers kind of look at the housing market this way, though? Where it's, they purchase a home, but they keep thinking the value of it needs to continually go up till you and basically get like a really absurd. Well, I mean, we talked about this, I think, last week just a little bit on the space where now you have like homes that are like $420,000 in like a working class area. So, I mean, companies have the same idea too, where every quarter they have to make more than they made the quarter before that. And if they don't, then they just kind of grind their employees into dust until they can like squeeze out the last little bit of profit. But you do end up hitting a wall eventually. And I don't know how to like undo that kind of mindset unless it's just a generational culture mindset where when we see boomers fade off that people stop thinking like this. I'm not for sure.
Yeah, so a lot of the issue is and this kind of ties back a little bit to, I mean, maybe only indirectly, about how there's just such an obsession with efficiency. So the problem is the conversation around economics, especially among conservatives, gets a little bit skewed. For one, because there's just so much fear of things like socialism, which is legitimately bad. Like, you really don't want socialism, especially not in a country like the U.S. But what happens is the conversation always centers around like what's the best way to increase wealth, which really is, I mean, just to be flat out, the best way to build wealth is to be as efficient as possible. Like, no tariffs. I mean, no taxes. So, like, if you get into like libertarian financial theory, that's why they hate taxes so much. That's a big part of it anyway, is that it adds inefficiencies to the market. And that's fine. But like, the issue is you there's a secondary access you have to address, which is like, what's the point of making money? Like, there's a way to make tons and tons of money. I mean, like, one way to think of it this way, like, if you were to run your household budget in a way that was perfectly efficient from an economic standpoint, you would never buy anything. Like, you would never buy food, you wouldn't buy a house, you wouldn't buy a car. You would literally just pump every cent you own into, I mean, essentially the stock market or some form of investment. But of course, we all know that's absurd. Like, you have to eat to survive. You have to have a house. Like, you have to, have fun with your kids. And so, like, people get that at sort of a household level. But it's like when you get to the national level, you forget that those rules apply. So you'll talk to someone and they'll say, like, hey, we shouldn't add tariffs because it makes our economy less efficient and we'll have less wealth. And there's some truth to that. And you don't want to ignore that completely. Like, if you have a horrible economy, that's really terrible for your quality of life. But at the same time, you do have to ask the question, like, from a national perspective, like, why do we want this money? And a lot of people can't answer that. And nobody wants to answer that. And so the answer just becomes, who cares? Like, just make as much as possible. But we're seeing the fruit of it now. You end up selling off, or you end up corroding all the things about national life that make a nation worth living
Well,
in.
there's no investment anymore in our country. When I mean investment, I mean like our grandfathers and fathers. They took the money that they had and they built these large institutions, or they poured it into the churches. Uh, Educational, like they built colleges, or at least huge huge sums of their wealth went towards expanding colleges. And we don't do that. I mean, everything that we do now is, how do I have more money in my portfolio at the end of the day? And I don't even plan on like passing this money down to my kids all that much, because right before I die, I'm going to go into a bougie retirement home that costs $10,000 a month, that has I don't know, a pickleball court and a swimming pool, and I'll just fade off into the sunset with like 5 cruises a year. So I mean, they're not even like the wealth that they're having. They're not even transferring it down to their children. They're transferring it to second, third organizations that are just even like more consumerist and hedonistic. So we're not getting anything
Well,
beautiful in our society, and we're not passing down inheritance anymore.
yeah, that's my point. Like, if you're totally concerned with efficiency, like, that's what I'm saying. If you're totally concerned in efficiency, you don't even invest in physical things, like in a purely economic sense, you would only ever invest in more money. I mean, that's what banks do. I mean, like, banks have purchasing departments that all they do is purchase, like, they just purchase money, or like they purchase financing instruments, and whose sole purpose is to make more money. At a bank, that's fine. I mean, that's the reason a bank exists, is to grow their, capital pool for have that attitude. So, yeah, like you don't invest in anything beautiful because beauty doesn't make you money. Although, of course, we do see baby boomers sort of unfortunately, more of an obsession with end of life comfort, which does seem to be really kind of obscene at a certain point. But yeah, and I mean, as a nation, I mean, that's that sort of, residual personal understanding about your own needs, at least, doesn't even translate into the nation, because the nation doesn't have much of a self identity. And so, yeah, like all you're doing is investing in increasingly abstract financial instruments that do create a lot of money. Like America does have an extraordinarily high GDP, but you don't seem to get much of value out of it because you're just using that money to get more money, which, again, at a certain point is kind of necessary. But if that's all you focus on, you do end up losing most of the things that make, life worth living. So, yeah, and I mean, and like that goes back to the whole thing with tariffs, which was our original point. Those tariffs do make us less efficient. And, it's not super efficient to have a lot of these industries on your home soil. But for one, it is safer from a security standpoint, and it does improve your quality of life as a country. And that's the argument for it. I mean, that's really kind of the whole basis of it.
Well, something I noticed with some of the older folks, and I guess some of the middle-aged folks, they have a worship of the dollar, and I think it goes hand in hand with a lot of, those weird, like liberal types that we kind of poke fun at, but they worship their complete self-expression and freedom to do whatever they want. They kind of like some like backwards or like way out there libertarian type. But the older conservatives, they're very much in the same boat as all of them, because they're worshiping the dollar, and the dollar only serves them, and they derive their self-worth and their contribution just based off of a dollar value that they have somewhere in space. And they never actually, I mean, it's not like it's really tangible. It's some number they get on a piece of paper, and they use that number to buy a summer home and a beach home. I can't tell you how many older folks I run into, and they got 2 and 3 homes and all of these little fun toys, and it becomes a status thing, to kind of like a sacrifice to the worship of the dollar.
Yeah, if this was like the parable that Jesus gave about the master and the talents, and the master was a boomer, no one got any talents, and the master just like beat one, killed the other, and then told the other one to pull himself up by his bootstraps. That's basically what it would be.
Well, it also reminds me of the parable of the man who had great wealth, and so he decided to build new barns. And then he builds the new barns, and then he dies that night. And then he had to answer for his soul, and presumably he couldn't, in a spiritual sense. And I mean, again, we don't have to belabor the point, but it all just ties back to that same principle. Money is good. Money is a blessing. It can do a lot of great things, especially in the modern world. There has to be a reason for the money, though, besides just making more money. And if you lose sight of that, most good things will end up falling by the wayside. I was sort of wanting to pivot here a little bit. We've spoken about the sort of general basis of tariffs and sort of what they can accomplish on a domestic level. But our operations officer had some things he was wanting to get into about how our tariffs might end up impacting the growth of China, or maybe the lack thereof now.
Yeah, yeah. So to kind of start on that route, it's pretty obvious at this point that the entire tariff regime of the Trump presidency is targeted at China. I think it was a masterclass really in economics and in the Trumpian um, art of the deal, really forcing the entire effectively forcing the global economy to its knees, making everyone come begging, essentially strong arming everyone into making a deal with you, and then essentially setting up a system where every nation on the planet has to pick between the United States and China. I think that was just an absolute masterclass, and I don't think it's going to get enough attention, the amount that it deserves. But what the president is doing, I think, and this is from a non-economic view, I think it's brilliant because it's putting the world effectively into a us versus China um, situation, and we're going to be through these tariffs and other measures. We're attacking the Chinese economy directly. We're devaluing the yuan. I think the dollar has its strongest position against the yuan, however you say it, since the early 2020s. Um, we're potentially going to collapse the Chinese economy, which would just be phenomenal. The Chinese government regime, whatever, is entirely antithetical to the United States, to American civilization, and it really is our duty, really, to just pulverize them. And if we can do so without firing a shot, then that's just excellent. Um, so we'll see where these tariffs lead. If it makes the Chinese desperate, if it escalates the trade war, whatever the case may be. Um, the thing is with China in the United States, um, there's a concept in geopolitics called the Thucydides trap, and I'm sure a lot of people recognize this and recognize that its relationship to the United States and China. But for those who don't, it's the concept where a dominant power is in a conflict, whatever that looks like, with a rising power, and there is effectively a window of time where the rising power has the opportunity to knock off the dominant power, and the dominant power has its opportunity to stay top dog effectively. And after that window of time closes, the rising power reaches parity with the dominant power, and at that point they're peers. Throughout history, we've seen this. The classical example is Athens and Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. You can extrapolate it to examples all throughout history, but the example today is the United States and China. We are top dog globally in every regard. Maybe not industrial anymore, but that's coming back. The Chinese, on the other hand, they effectively have a national strategy, something that we don't really have, and they think long term. They call it the 2049 plan, essentially, where the Chinese government is trying to reach total parity, if not surpassing the United States in every regard, military, diplomatically, economically, influence, whatever, by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the completion of the revolution in China. And we keep creeping closer and closer to that date. And what we're seeing, obviously, is a mass buildup of the Chinese economy, of the Chinese military, of their technology sector, and they're catching up slowly. So, what the Trump administration is doing is they're the first administration ever, really, to be fighting back against the Chinese, and it's critical because you know we can pander to isolationism, to the classical America first. Let's sort out our problems here first kind of mindset. But at some point or another, we're going to have to face the Chinese And it's better to do so sooner rather than later, while that power parity is not there yet. Um, and to do so by economic means compared to military or other harsher strategies is, I think, the way to go about it.
There's something to add here. Um, Chief Slack was asking earlier about how much of the Chinese economy is tied up in the U.S. market. And, I was saying it's kind of hard to know. It's about 4.5% guaranteed, and there's other parts of the economy that are kind of roped into that. That's hard to quantify. But one thing that's worth bringing up is that China did do basically everything right when it came to gearing up their economy to be a peer power. But one thing they forgot to do was have kids. And I know we hear this point a lot, and it gets abused by people who want to support immigration. I understand that. But, one thing you have to consider is that if you want to have, a strong, growing economy, like no matter what type of economy it is, but, you know, China wants this big industrial economy. It wants to grow its GDP. Well, like, what market can it sell to? If you have a growing population, then you actually expand your GDP organically because you increase economic activity within your own borders. But China's on the press. I mean, like, China's already a shrinking population as far as like their trajectory is concerned, and they will start actually shrinking pretty aggressively, ironically, by 2049. 2049 is what, 24 years from now. Yeah, I mean, if you look at their aging trajectory, I mean, they're going to see a rapid population drop by about that time. And so this big growing economy, I mean, like, where are they going to grow? They can't grow in their own population, and so they are very, very, very reliant on exports for their growing economy. If the U.S. cuts them off, and if the U.S. kind of uses these tariffs as a way to kind of pressure our allies into decoupling from the Chinese industrial base, I mean, yeah, I mean the so-called Chinese century is going to get strangled in the crib. Like, where's it going to go? They can't sell to anyone. They can't sell to themselves because they're shrinking.
Right, and that's important because it also makes them it increases their instability. The Chinese system is inherently unstable. It's really a miracle that they're still afloat, right now. I don't know if you remember, but in 2020, is it 2021 or 2022? It might have been both, actually. But the Chinese real estate industry or market collapsed, and somehow, by the skin of their teeth, and I guess the benefits of the planned economy, if you want to call it that, they were able to artificially right that crisis. But real estate in China, real estate and construction, I think accounts for something in the order of 30% of their economy. It's massive. It's absolutely massive. And by nature of being a controlled, fixed economy, they overplan, overbuild, whatever, and you have the concept of the phenomenon of the Chinese ghost cities. Anyways, in 2022, I'm blanking on the particulars of the causes, but the system essentially collapsed, and somehow or another they were able to hold their economy together. Um, but that goes to say, that was from an internal shock. If we're applying, 125% tariffs on all their goods, and 40% of their GDP is affected by that, um, what is that going to do? How much are we going to crash their economy from doing that? How much more instability can we breed? How
And they're
disaffected?
already in a recession.
Yeah, precisely. How disaffected can we make their people, such that we don't even have to do any sort of regime change ourselves? It would be ideal, if we're talking about great power conflict with the Chinese. It would be ideal to just be able to sit back and watch them cave in on themselves and devolve into warlord states, all without a single boot on the ground. And maybe it's just optimistic. Maybe I'm just up in the clouds, but I'm really hoping that these tariffs will do a number on the Chinese state, for that matter.
I think too, another point is with the tariffs, they didn't, they were not taken off of Mexico and Canada as well. And that will also affect China because they were using NAFTA as a workaround as well. And they have a lot of industry and supply chains going through there.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That is a huge reason why Trump was more aggressive in giving those tariffs to everybody this time. Because Trump already tried to tariff China, not as much as he's doing now, but he gave them pretty hefty tariffs when he was in office, and they would just do that. They would go into other countries. They would just it's like, oh well, like I can't sell directly because of the tariff. Well, like we'll just quadruple our investment in our Mexican facilities or our Brazilian facilities, and we'll just get around the tariffs that way. And so Trump almost had to tariff the entire world just to keep China out.
Yeah, I think it's critical to just highlight that the entire strategy behind these tariffs was to bring the Chinese to heel. It really was masterful, and I can't overstate that. The the media, the academic class, whatever, the other effectively, lampooning the United States is isolating itself and putting itself apart from the rest of the world with these tariffs. But no, clearly we brought everyone to the negotiating table. We have new deals either already negotiated or being negotiated with all these countries. We're forcing the Chinese out of large parts of the global market. And the entire point of all of this is to put a stranglehold on the Chinese.
I think another point too is that it might be breaking the EU.
Yeah, I think the EU is trying to put a retaliatory package together, and their implementation date is the 15th of April, I want to say. And we'll
Yeah,
see
they
how
have
that
until then
goes.
to rescind it.
Yeah, the EU needs to be brought to heel as well, alongside the Chinese. Um, they're already
And
reorienting
Maloney in
themselves.
Italy,
Falling out of my hand.
Maloney in Italy has already come to the White House as well. So that begs the question of, is she negotiating for Italy and not the EU?
Yeah, breeding instability in the EU is a good thing as well. Every single aspect of Globo Homo Trash World that we're able to bring down, whatever the method it is a good thing. The Chinese, the EU, whatever. All of these institutions are disgusting, globalist, anti-Christian, anti-white countries and institutions that have to be broken in some manner. And if tariffs are the way that we tear the EU apart, then so be it.
I think it's kind of funny to
Another
harken
thing,
back to that little controversy we had a couple weeks ago now with Carl Benjamin and all the Euro dudes, freaking out about how Trump is torpedoed like any right movement because words and but if these tariffs actually break up the EU or strangle the EU, like we just gave them fertile ground to actually get up and do something and quit blackpilling.
yeah, you could see it in the recent polls for the AfD in Germany as well, that they are the top party now, which is kind of crazy. Another thing that's worth noting too is what these tariffs will be doing to currencies. The euro, the yuan, they're all going pretty ballistic. I believe Europe is the ones that were buying all of or selling all of our 10-year treasuries, and that has spiked to the euro, and that necessarily won't help things for them either. But I'm curious to see, how long they can do that and if that will inevitably crash because of it.
Looks like we lost Luke. Oh, there he is. Yeah, we'll see on that. And the bonds thing is one aspect, but like you said with Maloney coming to negotiate in the United States, if certain leaders in the EU or even certain party leaders within major blocs of the EU start negotiating with the United States, separate of their EU ties, that's breeding instability in the organization. It's breeding mistrust, which is a good thing for us. If the Italians, if the Hungarians, if the Poles want to come talk to the United States without the EU being involved, that's a good thing, because it proves both to the EU, to to the world, and to the people of those countries that the EU is not the federal state that it tries to be. Um, it's a soft way of breaking their power, their perceived power, as they try, to federalize themselves to create a super state, really against the will of the European people.
Also, all those European countries still have their own banks. It isn't there is a ECB, the Euro Bank, but they also have the German bond and the Italian and so on. So breaking up isn't necessarily that difficult.
Luke, you back?
Yep, I'm back.
There we go. Yeah, so we're just to bring you up to speed, Luke. We're talking about busting up the EU currently, with regard to the tariff packages.
Yeah, I don't know how that'll impact the EU. The EU, I think, has, actually, so this is kind of complicated too, and this will be interesting to see. The EU has actually approved retaliatory tariffs that are supposed to go into effect. I think it's the 15th. Trump did say today that negotiations were kind of contingent on not being retaliatory, and so I don't know if Trump is going to claim that European nations who didn't issue their own personal tariffs will be exempt, or whether every EU member state will be kind of caught up in that.
Do EU member states have the power to, I guess, go against the grain when it comes to whatever the EU economic policy is, or like what's that relationship?
I'm not entirely sure because, like you said, they still retain their own sovereign governments and they retain their own currencies. So I don't know. So it's more complicated now that the EU has actually made a decision. I think it was definitely up to the individual before that. I don't know what it's going to look like now. I'm not as familiar with how the EU works.
I know a lot of their stuff requires like a unanimous decision for like big sweeping actions. Like for instance, the Polish and Hungarians, they receive a ton of Euro bucks, and the rest of the EU was trying to cancel the Euro bucks going to Poland and Hungary because of their anti-immigration status. But when the vote came up against Poland, Hungary dissented against it, and so Poland got to keep their Euro bucks flowing in. And then same thing for Hungary. When Hungary's vote came up, Poland undercut that one as well. So I think they have it very much like a council sort of thing, and I think I think the tariffs that the EU wants to impose, I think they're going to kind of draw battle lines in the EU of who's a diehard committed globalist to the EU and who is not, who's someone who actually cares about their own country.
Yeah, I don't know if something. Yeah, I mean, this has kind of been a question in Europe for a while as to whether the EU is kind of a doomed project that will eventually collapse under its own weight, or whether it will actually succeed in creating a more unified Europe. I mean, almost like a United States. I find that difficult to imagine. I suppose it's not totally impossible. Ironically, something like the immigration they have now would actually play a role in that. Sort of like what it did in America, where all of the different white ethnic sort of solidified into an identity. when faced with integration. I don't know what the end result of all of that will be. I mean, like, I could see something like tariffs. Actually, honestly, depending on how Trump handles the tariffs, I could see it either pushing the EU together or forcing them apart. If Trump punishes all the EU member states together for EU actions, that could make them kind of a block. If he decides to deal with them piecemeal, you'll probably see the opposite effect. And so that'll actually be something really to keep an eye on in the next few weeks. I can see that really going either way.
Yeah, hopefully it goes the way of like you're saying with piecemeal, especially if it's true that the Italian government is trying to negotiate a separate deal. Maybe they would be the first of many or however many come forth and develop some sort of a separate deal. See.
Well, yeah, and there's also kind of the point too that the EU is sort of power projection for a few large European states.
Yeah.
So the EU kind of, I mean, like whether or not it actually benefits them, that's kind of a philosophical question. But as far as projection of power from their governments, France and Germany really benefit from it in a way that smaller nations do not. That's something to consider as well. Of course, some states are just locked into it because they're bad finances, like Greece.
Yeah.
So
Ben shared, China is willing to come to the negotiating table after Trump levies 125% tariffs. That is amazing. The raped, truly.
I really don't know what we're supposed to even be negotiating with them at this point. Because we just don't want free trade with them. Like,
and maybe negotiating with them means tariffs, but not 125% tariffs. um, that's really the only thing I could see coming out of this. Um, Trump being Trump, he's looking for a deal, I guess, wherever he can. Um, and I don't know. I really don't know. We'll see how that goes. It could go anyway. I don't know how willing he is to press a trade war right now, especially considering the domestic priorities of the administration. But at the same time, he's got a very anti-China rhetoric, and a lot of the base are kind of alongside that. So maybe he'll deny some sort of a deal or postpone it, whatever the case may be. Flex some muscles on the Chinese for a little while, but we'll see on that.
maybe we could get a two birds with one stone deal where we lower the tariffs, but only if they agree to take all the Mexicans we're deporting. So they can get they can get new blood to sort of grow their industrial base, and we can just have a place to send them.
Yeah.
That would be hilarious, but I think something Trump's aiming for. I've heard him mention it a handful of times, so I think there's some truth to it. It might not just be hyperbole, but China's been circumnavigating a lot of regulations, and I think that's also helped them grow their economy the way it has. So I think he's gonna, with this, if there's gonna be negotiations, I think he might force them to play by the rules and be shackled like everyone else is to regulations, and which in turn will also smack their economy pretty hard too. I don't see the Chinese coming out clean from this at all in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, the ball is totally it's totally in Trump's court. He really could do whatever he wanted at this point. If the deal looks like um, we lower the tariffs in exchange, you stop doing all this. Maybe you give all your farmland over. I don't know. He really could do anything at this point.
Well, and something else the Chinese probably realize is, so it's kind of easy to forget this now, but during Trump's first term, he was still kind of, aggressive against the Chinese. And if you remember, a lot of the liberal establishment at the time was very, very hostile to that. But then when Biden took over, people started noticing, hey, Biden kept all of those anti-China policies after Trump left. it kind of goes to the idea that the smarter of the Democrats kind of recognize that some of the stuff that Trump's doing just needs to happen. And so I think the Chinese are kind of thinking to themselves, like, this might not be a one-off. Whatever policy Trump solidifies or kind of lands on might be the one that the U.S. just keeps indefinitely. And they may be willing to aggressively negotiate just so they don't have to worry about those 125% tariffs being, a reality for 20 years.
Yeah, and I think the soft conflict with the Chinese is going to continue to evolve in all sorts of different spheres. Alongside the tariff issue, the Chinese put out a travel warning for tourists as well as students in the United States, warning them not to come to the country or to reconsider travel or reconsider being a student over here. So that could either go nowhere and just be rustling, or maybe that's a prelude to the Chinese pulling their students out of American universities, which from my experience dealing with Chinese students in an engineering college where we've got tons of government contract projects going on in the buildings and all these ITAR facilities. We're getting spied on by the Chinese. It happens on a daily basis. Um, there is no downside to removing every last Chinese student from the United States, and I think if we're going to be ramping up the pressure with the Chinese, and they're willingly pulling their students out of the United States as kind of a got you. Well, great. That's 270,000 Chinamen off the U.S. tax dollar not getting our education anymore, and I really want that to happen. That's honestly one of the highest priorities on my anti-China agenda. Just because of all the on the ground daily impacts of dealing with these people. It's terrible at these engineering schools. There's entire classes, entire departments for that matter, that are effectively non-white. They're about as white as like Southside Memphis or Eastside Memphis, and it's just astounding. In an American, um, highly ranked, state school research institution, nationally, globally ranked, to have 5 graduating white students in a class of 400 or 500 in a particular program. And so any policy that we can bring forth or force other countries to bring forth that gets these people out of the United States is music to my ears, really.
Well, yeah, and this goes to, I think, maybe like the last big thing we can say about this China conflict is that whatever Trump does, Trump is building a case against the Chinese. And even if the actual trade war calms down, which I don't think it totally will, like, I think some of these tariffs, and especially these new negotiated tariffs to kind of target China, I think those are kind of here to stay, at least at some level. I don't know if it'll stay as high as it is right now, but if nothing else, Trump has also built a case against the Chinese, which will sort of justify him in the eyes of the public for doing a lot of other things with the Chinese that needed to happen that go beyond trade. So, I mean, yeah, we have a ton of spies in America. We have a ton of spies in Canada, and that matters to us because those Canadian, well, not just, well, no, well, sorry, Chinese spies, not to mention Indian spies too, are in the Canadian government and have access to our shared intel. Like, that's a whole other thing too. So, like, by building a case against the Chinese, he has action to remove Chinese students who are spying on us. He has access to target Chinese industrial leaders who are behind some of this theft and subversion. That it kind of builds a case for that. I mean, there's the whole issue of Chinese owned farmland that was brought up earlier. I mean, seizing land is very unpopular in America, but like, look, it's not good that China owns. I think I remember someone saying once that China, if you added up all the land that China owns through like these subsidiaries, so like, I mean, like this is very much the case in North Carolina. These legacy companies that still retain their English names are essentially wholly owned by the Chinese, and so the Chinese just own all this farmland through these subsidiaries. I think I remember someone saying once that if you added all that land together, it would be approximately the size of Virginia. If you're just talking about square footage owned by Chinese ag. And
It's massive
yeah,
and it's strategically located. They love buying up farmland next to American military bases.
yeah, I know. Imagine that. and, and so, yeah, I mean, like Trump is building a case where he can seize land, where he can deport students, where he can target Chinese industrial leaders. He's even, I mean, again, like even building enough of a case that he could probably like kind of, play hardball with the Canadian government, either threaten to kick them out of our intel sharing agreements or can pressure them to get Chinese, MPs or probably Indian MPs too, for that matter, out of their out of their security apparatuses. I mean, there's a lot that has to happen with them besides trade, and by Trump focusing so much on their bad impact on us, he's, you know, again, I mean, I keep saying it, but he's building a case, and when he does it, the public will be more likely to accept it.
Yeah, we build the case, we shake the tree, and we see what happens. We're just doing OODA loops over and over, and it's the small things really. Everyone wants to clap, snap your fingers and deport 100 million immigrants and get rid of all the Chinese, but you can't really do that in the real world. You can, but it's unethical. And these policies are the most effective, the best way that we have to punish the Chinese, to put America first in this regard. And it's important that people understand that this is a process. It's not an immediate thing. For all these types out here that are criticizing the president for not having achieved every single campaign promise. Well, it's been 11 weeks since the inauguration. We've got 3 and 2/3 years left of the president. And all that to say, time will tell. These things are a process, and if things are happening at the rate they're happening right now, within 4 years, maybe there will be no Chinese farmland in the United States, and maybe every single Chinese student in American universities will be gone. And I think it's important. I think it's hopeful to look forward to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And this is true of like everything. It's not just true of the Chinese, like you're saying, it's true of immigration. It's true of, I mean, it's true with even solving things like Social Security. Like all this stuff requires time. It requires, I don't want to say propaganda, but like, you know what I mean? Like it requires like a lot of public messaging. It requires you to like, get a handle on the courts. Like all this stuff has to happen before, the big fix comes, so to speak. And so, best we can do is support the president best we can, and kind of keep hammering these points home too, so that people in the admin don't get you know lost in their own kind of side priorities.
Yeah. And that's probably enough on the topic. We can continue beating a dead horse all day long. It's always great to talk about the Chinese, and how much we need to deal with them, whatever that looks like. But are there any other topics we wanted to hit on tonight?
Well, I think that was our big one, and it's 20 after 9, so probably too late to start something new at this point.
Yeah, fair enough. It's always fun to ramble for an hour.
Well, so before we go, is there any sort of announcements that our officers would like to make regarding our society, regarding future plans, anything along those lines?
Um, the big thing from my side of the house, or I guess from all the officers for that matter, is we are finally publishing our weekly newsletter starting this weekend. We're gonna, I think, push it out Sunday evenings, either Sunday evenings or Sunday mornings, one or the other. I forget. But all of our members and then anyone who signs up on our website will have access to that. That way, information's easier to disseminate. Stuff doesn't get buried on the X page or in group chats or whatever. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yes, this is a good point. Yeah, good point about how this is, if you're in North Carolina especially, this is good for recruiting members who don't want to be active on Telegram. We assume there's actually probably a lot of people like that. Not everybody loves these chats like we do. And so that's a good way to keep.
I guess along those lines, one other thing from our wonderful secretary, we got to do some good shilling and plugging. I'm gonna put it in the chat and then also go ahead and announce it in here. But check out our website, NathanaelGreeneSociety.org. Got our email on there. If you're interested in joining up with the society, send us an email. Same thing, Old Glory Club. If you're not in the state of North Carolina but you want to join a chapter, there's almost certainly one in your area. So that's Old Glory Club. Send them an email and they'll get you hooked up. And then definitely go through the OGC link to buy some Alps. They are probably the best nicotine pouches on the market right now, and I am heavily addicted to them.
Well, good. And one final thing, if there is not an Old Glory Club chapter near you, you can always start one. The Central Committee has done a good job of making that process pretty seamless and not overly difficult. So I highly recommend you doing that if you don't live near one. So, well, with that being said, I think we're probably good to get off for the evening. Thank you for joining us, and we will be back again at the same time next week, and we'll have, as always, great guests and great topics, and we look forward to seeing you then.